in the library world, you hope for events that are either important or interesting. You'll take either. You hope for ones that are both. Tonight we have one that is both, and I'm thrilled about it. And I'm going to get right to it because Angela knows a lot more about me. Angela is Angela Petochnick. She is the director of the Center for Public Engagement with Science at the University of Cincinnati, which is as cool as it sounds. Trying to have people interact with science in a smart, reasonable way. You wouldn't think that would be controversial, but somehow it has become a little controversial. So I'm glad Angela is here. She is, in addition to that, she is also a professor of philosophy, which I always just think is so great. She's the only professor of philosophy I know, so she is easily my favorite. And she's also been a great friend to the library over the last couple of years, helping us put on really smart programming. So I'm going to introduce Angela, and Angela will then introduce Sarah. So why don't you guys come on up? And again, thank you very much. You might have to wait a second.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for coming. This feels momentous to me because it's my first sort of real, for me anyway, it's first in-person kind of public programming to be involved in, for a while. So as John said, I'm Angela Petochnick, Director of the Center for Public Engagement with Science at the University of Cincinnati, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sarah S. Richardson. Sarah is professor of the history of science and of studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University. She also went to graduate school at the same time and same institution that I did, so I have known her since then. We were both at Stanford University in sort of overlapping but not the same programs at the same time. Professor Richardson is a leading scholar of gender and science whose research focuses on sex, gender, sexuality, and sort of most relevant for tonight's discussion, reproduction. She directs the Harvard Gender Sci Lab, which is a collaborative interdisciplinary research lab dedicated to generating concepts, methods, and theories for biomedical research of on sex and gender. Dr. Richardson is the author of Sex Itself, The Search for Male and Female in the Human Genome, which is a fabulous book that we're not going to talk about tonight. So if you want, you can actually buy it back there if you're interested. It's a really wonderful book. Some of my intro undergrad students read a popular news accounting of some of the ideas in that book this week, actually, coincidentally. She also has a new book coming out this fall, which is The Maternal Imprint, The Contested Science of Maternal-Fetal Effects. And so this is what we're talking about tonight. In particular, I'll be doing my best to ask her some questions that will sort of lead us through some of the main ideas and important themes from that book. So Dr. Richardson has also edited 2 books, Revisiting Race in a Genomic Age, as well as Post-Genomics, Perspectives on Biology After the Genome. And she's published a wide range of academic articles. Her work has also appeared in popular forums, including Slate, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. And it's always important, I think, to include that when you're talking about academics, at least academics of the stripe that Sarah and I are, because it's not that common still for people who are philosophers and historians, I think, to be writing in public places and to have work featured in public venues as well. So I think it's an important part of Sarah's profile. So that is Sarah Richardson. Now I awkwardly don't know whether, because I just introduced you, whether we should applaud or I should jump right into my questions.
Let's jump right in. Thank you, Angela.
Sorry about that, meta comment. Okay, so now we will jump right on. Thanks for accommodating my sort of insecurity about whether we needed applause. All right, so I want to start at the beginning and ask you what the topic of the book is. So what is the basic idea of maternal-fetal effects? Is there a quick example you can give that we might all be familiar with?
Okay, so the book is about the science and the history of science of claims about the long reach of your time in the womb. The idea that there are long-term implications for the individual, not just of the genes that are transmitted to them by each of their parents, but of the environment in which they were gestated. And many people are familiar with some of the most striking studies around this, the Dutch Famine studies, about gestational exposure to the Dutch Famine of 1944 and the long-term metabolic effects of that for those individuals. Other examples of research in this field include looking at the experience of stress during gestation, other aspects of nutrition or the health of the mother. I want to distinguish this from a whole body of work on prenatal influences that sits alongside maternal effects science, but is not exactly what I'm talking about today. And that is work on maternal-fetal toxicology. So we all know that there are certain toxins that can cross the placenta and lead to immediately observable effects at birth, caused birth defects, in other words. And that body of work precedes, in some ways, had its heyday before what I'm thinking of, which has really taken off over the last 20 to 30 years, which is a body of work on the developmental origins of health and disease, looking at far more subtle effects, maternal experiences of stress, fleeting dietary exposures, small deviations in metabolic status of the mother during pregnancy, and how that might relate not only to long-term implications for the individual, but intergenerationally. Those are some of the most contested claims.
So maybe directly on that last point that you made. So you said early on that this is sort of looking beyond how mothers and fathers, for that matter, influence their offspring genetically. But that might be something that's worth us sort of pausing on a bit more. How does this phenomenon that you're looking at, maternal-fetal effects in particular, go beyond that idea? And if you want, how does it relate to the idea of genetic transmission?
Yeah, I'm really glad you framed it that way because, I mean, at heart, I'm a historian of genetics. And I came to this project, you mentioned the book on the sex chromosomes. I came to this project having thought in all sorts of ways about 20th and 21st century genetics, which we sometimes call transmission genetics, right? So these are the elements, the particles that are transferred to offspring through the nucleus of the gamete. And this is a form of heredity, again, called transmission genetics. But at the edges of this are other, more nebulous, more contested forms of heredity. And maternal effects is one of those contested other forms of heredity. It is a phenomenological effect of the mother on the offspring that is not transmitted through the particles, but is due to the environment provided by the mother. And it is this sort of fuzzy, contested area of speculation, an area that has sometimes been held up by those who are concerned about genetic determinism and gene centrism as complicating and filling out our picture of heredity. So it relates in complex ways, not just to reproduction, but to our constructs of what is inherited, right? And it tangles in ways full of tension with our genetic theories of inheritance. And in the middle of that is the maternal body. And as a gender studies scholar and a historian of science focused on genetics, it was just a perfect mix. And I was drawn to try to understand what this construct of maternal effects had meant to so many different scientists, different scientific fields, and even social arenas.
Thank you. That's fascinating and helpful. So I want to pause at this point then and take a step back. And you touched on sort of what this work means to you as a gender scholar. And I did want to ask a question about you and your research. So you're not a scientist doing research on maternal-fetal effects, right? So you're not in that role. And I think that's maybe the first place that our mind goes to when we think about academics who can comment on that research. So could you describe for us what your research does look like and how it's relevant to the topics that are in your book?
Sure. So I am very privileged to be able to grapple with science and be in dialogue with scientists using the tools of history and philosophy and social studies of science. And my practice has always been to search through the history of a field to identify moments of contestation. And in those moments of contestation, as a scholar, I can uncover so much. It's unveiled to me how different social dimensions, contextual dimensions of the science play a role in how the ideas are formed. A lot of my work involves deeply reading the science and reconstructing its history in relation to its cultural context. The other part of my practice, you mentioned the Gender Sci Lab, which is a passion of mine, is to sustain interdisciplinary community and constant dialogue between people from the humanities and social sciences and research scientists. And so that is an interdisciplinary space where scientists and biomedical researchers from fields as diverse as bioanthropology, evolutionary science, cell and molecular biology, public health, and neuroscience interface with gender studies scholars and science studies scholars and folks from philosophy to grapple with, again, these contested claims in the sciences of sex and gender. We have lots of low-hanging fruit in this area, and I really believe that the way to move forward on those sorts of contested issues is to bridge these different areas of thought and bring them into dialogue with each other through sustained community among people in those different fields. So to answer your question, my work is interdisciplinary, and it's also very focused on engaging outwardly with scientists from my little place over in this interdisciplinary location.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so from that, I want to dive right into sort of asking you to describe some of the messy details of current research into maternal-fetal effects. So in particular, in the introduction, you draw this nice contrast with an example that I think a lot of us are familiar with, which is the interventions in the late 20th century that radically reduced birth defects that were related to folic acid deficiencies by supplementing basically all of us with folic acid all the time, I think, which was highly successful, and we all know about it, and it seems kind of simple and straightforward, kind of magic bullet kind of action. So how is current research into maternal-fetal effects today different from that? Or is it?
Yeah, so this goes to the point I was making earlier, that I want to distinguish different sorts of claims that are made in the space. There's the sort of claim that is a dose-dependent response to a teratogen or a deficit, which then leads to some sort of birth anomaly. So a very good example of that is folic acid deficiency and neural tube defects. It's probably the singular intervention that has changed the incidence in birth defects the most over the last 50 years. It's an extraordinary story, and it's relatively recent. The studies that confirmed the role of folic acid supplementation in preventing neural tube defects were only really came out in the early 1990s. So it's an extraordinary example of intervention in prenatal health that is almost unmatched. There are very few examples that reach that high bar. So if we think there's this whole space of claims, I'm really thinking about much, much more subtle claims. So I'd like to give the example, I mentioned the Dutch famine before, which I've always been incredibly fascinated by, partly because my own grandmother lived through the Dutch famine in Amsterdam at age 19, and almost starved to death, and remembers eating tulip bulbs, and it's been part of our own family lore. And so I've always been interested in these studies that reconstructed cohorts of individuals gestated during that period. But just to say, so that is one of the most persuasive studies demonstrating associations between early life exposures. And now these are extreme exposures, extreme nutritional deprivation, rarely replicated, and later effects. Those studies have found very few effects of even this extreme nutritional deprivation. But they have found some. And an example of one of the findings is that in their 50s, women who were gestated during the famine have about 2 centimeters of extra girth around their weight. So this is a very different sort of claim you can immediately see from the folic acid type claim, right? We're talking about causal chains that are decades long, right? Exposures during the fetal period that are usually far more speculative than documented caloric deprivation that we have in the case of the famine. And then having 2 centimeters extra around your waist is something. It's something you can measure, but it isn't the same thing as having a neural tube defect, right? So small effect sizes, associations many decades apart, and these are very ecologically specific. So these same findings of central adiposity in women have not been found in other famine exposure, gestational exposure studies. So it's this body of claims that much better characterizes the last 30 to 50 years of maternal effects research that is at the heart of this book.
Thanks. So Sarah and I have been talking about this separately today. It's an incredibly ambitious book. There are lots of themes that I want to try to adequately get us toward in this conversation. And so one of the ways in which it's ambitious is it isn't just the story of maternal effects research as it is now, but also traces the history of that research as well. So can you tell us a little bit about how maternal effects research has changed over time?
Yes, it is. I'm never going to bite off this big of a subject. I did treat the subject to my satisfaction and answered all of my questions about it, but wow, it's a topic that covers so many different disciplines and so many different social arenas. But historically, before the arrival of August Weismann's theory of the continuity of the germplasm at the end of the 19th century, that's the theory that really what is inherited is just that material in the nucleus, not what the organism has imbibed over its lifetime. Until then, it was the view, the commonplace view, that mothers and fathers contribute qualitatively distinctive things to offspring. So I call this asymmetry of contribution of mothers and fathers. This view had all sorts of conformations. If you go back to Aristotle, the view is basically that it is the father who contributes the animating spirit of the organism, and it is the mother that contributes the form. Right? And these ideas about what the mother and father contribute tracked ideas about men's and women's roles in the world. They were thought to elaborate fundamental complementarities and oppositions, principles of maleness and femaleness. And Weismann, the opening chapter of the book is about Weismann's radical challenge to this long-standing tradition. And I reread August Weismann's essays, which are actually wonderful, and like the kind of writing about science writing that is not always available anymore. And these philosophical essays elaborating the germplasm theory are also very much trying to set forth a theory of sex equality in heredity. And the book sort of begins there. It is a radical challenge to a long-standing, deeply rooted idea about male and female contributions to heredity and development. Often Weissman is seen as part of the genetics revolution, but I point out that he's also part of a total revolution in the thinking about what males and females are and what they contribute to the next generation. So we can start there and see that starting in the early 20th century with the development of genetics and the chromosomal theory of inheritance, we have a profound challenge to long-standing ideas that were not just folk ideas, they were scientific ideas. Leading embryologists in the 19th century argued that males and females contribute different things to offspring. And this challenge to this idea of sex inequality or asymmetry in contributions to heredity brings a number of debates. And so there is, I can continue or maybe, what I try to do is reconstruct how the folks who long held on to those beliefs grappled with Weissman's views. And what I show is that those who held on to the idea that mothers play a particular role in heredity, and it is through the intrauterine period, are those who were allied in all sorts of ways with Lamarckian ideas, with ideas about the ability to overcome one's heredity, with feminist ideas about the importance of the maternal contribution. It's really a wild and widespread literature, much more widespread in the early 20th century than I thought I would find, that is challenging Weissman's ideas and the new genetics, arguing for the importance, the overriding importance of the womb in which you are gestated. And then we can go on from there. But what we see is a back and forth about these ideas all through the 20th century. And this set of debates is really about several things. It is about gene centrism. It is about the social environment and and the physical environment and its imprint on our bodies. And it is about women's reproductive autonomy and women's bodies and freedoms, all at the same time.
That's fascinating. So what can really be told, and I think has been told to me at various points as sort of a pretty simple story of like scientific progression, actually turns out to be like this really complex combination of priorities and views and new ideas that sort of inform each other in these sort of bulky, messy packages, kind of, if that makes sense. Okay, so I want to shift some from thinking about the nature of maternal effects and the scientific research on them to how that relates, or I guess diving more into how that relates to these sort of broader social ideas that can be bound up with them. So this is a theme that comes up at various points in the book as well, but there's one formulation of it that I particularly like. You describe how maternal effects research is in part an expression of social alarm about how women of reproductive age act and how this might influence their babies. So you also, sort of in that theme, talk about this website, beginbeforebirth.org. Could you say more about this website, and then more generally zooming out from that, this sort of social alarm in general, and how that's part of the story?
Yeah, it's a great example. Undoubtedly part of what drew me to writing about this topic was the incredible uptick in interest in and messaging to women about maternal-fetal effects. And Begin Before Birth is a website designed by scientists at the Wellcome Trust in the UK to convey the new science of epigenetics. We can talk more about that term, epigenetic programming and maternal-fetal effects. And you would open it, and a video would begin showing a male child wearing a hoodie and sort of looting the streets This website was developed shortly after the looting of 2011 in the UK, in London. And then it goes on to narrate a story, Charlie's story, of all of his problems with ADHD and how he's going to end up in prison and and then it ends by saying, if only his mother had not been so stressed while she was pregnant, right? And then it has instructions for mothers. It says, if you're stressed, what you should really do is do some yoga, listen to some music, because otherwise, every movement you make, you could be epigenetically programming your offspring. It just gets better because there's a game that you can play on the website. And the game is a video game, and it has a mouse, and you're supposed to sort of feed the mouse something on a certain schedule, and if you don't click it just in time, it has a little ticker that tells you you've increased their programming of stress. And so the notion is that every mark you make on your offspring while pregnant, I mean, it's a very stress-inducing website, I have to say. So this is just one, I mean, that's just dipping your toe into the enormous sea of these sorts of claims, which run very far ahead of empirically demonstrated claims. These are theories, and they're being rushed out as direct advice to women for how they should behave, and even as in this website, how they should reflect on retrospectively the causality of their children's problems. You know, all the time in history, philosophy, and social studies of science, we think about contested areas of science, climate change, and other sorts of claims across biomedicine. But this one's ripe for the picking. And so I really wanted to tackle this, to give it some historical context, give it some serious, critical, conceptual analysis, and that is motivated by my concern for the way in which these ideas are rapidly translated, not only as advice for women, but as public health dicta and into clinical practice in ways that make women feel as if they have essentially already failed before they've begun.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a powerful example. There's another example that's important to your book, and you work through it in chapter 6. And I'm hoping you can talk us through this as well. It sort of further explores this space of the social influences on the science and social impact on sort of, I guess, interpretations of the science in popular spaces. And that is in particular, chapter 6 focuses on the example of research into birth weight. So can you walk us through that example as well?
Okay, so birth weight is, it's a funny one. Some of the research I did for the book was at the UCLA baby book collection. They have the largest collection of baby books. You know those books where parents, usually mothers, would put all of the significant developments in the weight of the baby as it grows and so on. And you know, the fact that in a typical birth announcement we report the weight of the baby at birth is a very historically recent thing, that we think this is a very important metric, that you have created a baby of a certain weight. And now, of course, why do we think that's important? Because we think the weight reflects on the prenatal period. And it became, in the mid-20th century, a leading indicator, not just of fetal health and maternal success, in a way. So I saw in the baby books how in the 1940s people started to record weights. It wasn't such an important metric before. This became not only a metric of individual achievement and health, but also you would see charts comparing the average birth weights of different nations and of different ethnic populations and so on. So a marker, a biomarker, an objective measure that travels across space in so many ways. Now, birth weight is extremely fascinating because it is actually, in the end, an incredibly inept way of measuring fetal health. But the story of how that came to be appreciated is is one that I wanted to tell. But moreover, the case of birth weight reminds us that this research into maternal-fetal effects in humans is not just, as it may have come out so far, it's not just some sort of patriarchal project to control women or something like that. It has been part of a very important interest in the body as biosocial, as at once biological and also imbibing its social environment. And birth weight tells that story very nicely. It's part of the history of how we came to think of bodies that way. And this is in particular due to the history of looking at differences in average birth weight between African Americans and white Americans. And that's the story I tell in that chapter. It's an incredible story of challenging scientific conventions. When the story begins, most people think that there are genetic differences between the races in average birth weight. It took work by pioneering social epidemiologists and pediatricians, some of whom are under-recognized African American researchers in the 1950s, to overturn that idea and to demonstrate this extremely strong association between, for example, access to prenatal services and birth weight. But the story gets very hairy as it goes on. More and more things are attributed to being low birth weight, including things like IQ. And when you tangle that into questions of race and social influences and biology, we get a story about how it isn't always straightforwardly a progressive move or reframe to go from the bio to the biosocial. And I talk about the various ways in which ideas of inadequate gestation in the womb are used to try to overcome genetic theories of differences in achievement between racial groups in the United States in the mid-20th century, and the ways in which those create their own somatic determinisms, right, and their own notions of bio-underclasses, right? And so this is my way of exploring some of the tensions in biosocial science and also telling the story of the strong allegiance to maternal-fetal effects research of those who are interested in how the social gets under the skin, right? A progressive science that sought to reframe biologically determinist ideas. In the end, birth weight is rejected by scientists who focus on maternal-fetal effects as a valid measure of the maternal-fetal period. And scientists begin to search for other mechanisms, other ways to, in a more fine-grained way, document how what happened in the fetal period influences later outcomes. And that is how I turn to theories of fetal programming and epigenetics in the later part of the book.
Thank you. I have a little follow-up, which is, what does that do to that earlier research, right? You told us this sort of inspiring story about sort of how the scientific picture improved in ways that undermined a sort of simple, maybe naive, genetic kind of racism. So what happens now that we've moved on from birth weight, that the scientific story has moved on from birth weight?
Right. So you mean to the epigenetics and all of that? Or
I meant
even the overturning.
What do we think about the earlier
right.
part of the story
Yeah.
then, from once the second part of the story is added on? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So once we begin to think of bodies and child outcomes as both biological and social, then you get a set of claims about the womb being an environment, and the mother is the environment of the fetus, right? And then the mother is the place where you have to intervene to change the outcomes. And in this picture, there then become riskier and less risky mothers, and this is marked by race and by class in these pictures. And so you have this notion of less productive, less efficient, and I'm using some of the language from the literature, mothers. And so there are incredibly stigmatizing ideas. Furthermore, you get this notion that everything that's important for a person's outcome actually happens before birth. And this leads to some strange, perhaps unexpected side effects, right? Disinvestment in early life, pre-K education and so on, because the harm's already been done before birth, right? So these ideas can be quickly turned around from how they might have imagined to be demonstrating the importance of the social to instead suggest that you have a class of people that has already been lesioned, that the most important things have happened during the period of prenatal plasticity, and they now are programmed and cannot be overcome. And so all we can do is accommodate ourselves to this. In a famous quote from David Barker, one of the founders of this field, he said, "The womb may be more important than the home for a child's outcome." And I felt strongly that the folks in this field, however meritorious and arduous their studies have been, have gotten themselves into a very narrow way of thinking about the social determinants of health. And I wanted to reframe and sort of historicize how they got there, right? To be making such strong claims about determinants of life outcomes and health outcomes. So that gives a sense of some of the tensions and contradictions. You start with a starting point of wanting to highlight the role of the social, and you end with a sort of a different kind of biodeterminist idea of social stratification.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. So I want to move in a different direction and ask you more about this interface between the scientific research and popular representations. I'm really interested in how science and the public come together, as we've talked about already. And earlier we got a couple of really nice, in this discussion, we got a couple of really nice examples of the difference between, on the one hand, the maternal effects research showing 2 centimeters of body fat on average, right, from this really extreme prenatal circumstance that was encountered, versus, on the other hand, things like I have to look at my notes, the Begin Before Birth website, right? The sort of really dramatic, stark popular representation of where the research is. Okay, so there's this stark contrast between at best subtle relationships uncovered, but then what actually sort of is filtered through to what the rest of us hear is this sort of really stark kind of sort of really heavy story about the significance. So why do we see that disconnect?
So I think that the drama of the last 100 years of research on maternal fetal effects is largely one of going from very low tolerance, I tell this story in the book, low tolerance for the idea that maternal effects are real. After Weissman and after genetics, people say, stop with the old wives' tales. Don't believe those who argue that the mother during the gestational period has to do any more than just eat nutritious food and be safe. And a lot of a high bar for causality, for making causal claims about this period, to what I call a much more causally permissive environment for making these claims. So we're again looking at associations. I call them cryptic. They're small effect sizes at a long distance, I mean temporal distance from cause to effect, that are ecologically specific, and very often, in contrast to the Dutch famine case, you don't know the dosage of the exposure. These are cryptic claims in the best case. But these are regarded today as as acceptable, robust claims sufficient to sustain research programs and translate to public health. So how did we get here? It has to do with an expansion in tolerance for causally permissive claims in this space that I argue has to do with social beliefs about the role of the mother in causing outcomes for offspring. Common sense, everyday ideas are transmitted into science to sustain a research program that largely focuses on maternal-fetal effects to the exclusion of paternal effects, the larger social environment. And I actually am able to document this sort of looping process of creating a set of databases, a record of literature, and so on, that systematically excludes investigation of these other causes. So I spend a lot of time in the book grappling with causality and our tolerance for this kinds of claims making in this space. I think this is important because this kind of claims making is not exclusive to maternal-fetal science. It's becoming increasingly common in what I call the post-genomic sciences, where we use big data to find correlations in these large data sets and attach them to population health. So if we're going to be positing these sort of cryptic relationships as central to our picture of positive health behaviors and risk reduction, we need to grapple with how the space between the evidence offered and the causal claim made allows the entry of social and cognitive assumptions into it. And so, as someone interested in gender in science, I'm very interested in how all of these beliefs then come to be solidified and entrenched in the scientific theories and in fact go unquestioned.
Okay, so there's this disconnect between the scientific research and the popular representations of it. And part of that is that the science is increasingly, and it sounds like broadly, not just maternal effects research, in the post-genomic age, it's increasingly sort of investigating these really subtle causal relationships, this cryptic causality. And then that's, as you say, sort of this space where it sounds like, if I understand correctly, social preconceptions, sort of shared ideas kind of find their way in and amplify certain messages and maybe reduce other messages that might come from the science. Okay. And you've given us lots of nice examples of that, I think, in how you've talked through the history of this research tonight. So if that's the situation, then what does it look like I take it that that's sort of not an ideal outcome, that we have but I can't remember the website for some reason, Begin Before Birth website, while the research is so out of step with that. So given the sort of diagnosis of this disconnect, what is an improved relationship between the scientific research that is about cryptic causality and is subtle in this way and popular representations to a broader public look like?
Yeah, I think that, of course, there's nothing wrong with studying these interesting processes. And it depends what your aims are, first of all. If your aim is to understand the processes of development and the interaction between the maternal being and the fetal being and how factors might play a role in that development, that's one thing. But it's the frame of risk discourse that is problematic around this science. In fact, if you look at the last 30 to 50 years of this research, there is no finding from developmental origins of health and disease or fetal programming research and epigenetics that has led to an intervention that causally improves outcomes for infants. Okay, remember in the background we have the folic acid example. So this is not the sort of research that is well positioned to advance infant research, however much the scientists in it would love to. It's not that they set out to study cryptic effects, it's just that that's what they find when they do the studies. So if our frame is risk discourse, and it's a sort of social panic around outcomes for infants and an intolerance for any level of risk to a fetus, then we're going to interpret that 50 years of research in one light, which is lots and lots of findings of associations. Cryptic, yes. Small effect sizes, yes. Not replicated all the time, yes. But lots of findings. Or we can look at that 50 years and say, actually, this field of research has given us a profound record of resilience and how very little these exposures matter. That fetal outcomes there are some known things that lesion out those outcomes and lead to poor health outcomes or developmental outcomes for infants, the most important being premature birth. And there are, ways in which extreme exposures, right? So extreme nutritional deprivation, for example, can cause these outcomes. There's teratology, where a toxin can cause an abnormality. But this field of research reframed to be one that is not focused on risk, but on developmental plasticity, resilience, redundancy, and indeed the multiple pathways through which we can get health, and refocused on considering not just maternal effects in a vacuum, for after all, if all you test are the effects, the exposure of the mother and the outcome in the infant, you actually haven't answered your question, which is it a maternal effect? Because you need to include fathers and other confounding variables to sort out that question. So contextualizing the findings, moving away from a risk discourse, moving away from a discourse that suggests we can use these findings to compel women's behavior during pregnancy, and instead to one that is about empowering people to consider these findings with respect to their own risk tolerance and lifestyle. All of this would be, I think, a salutary turn in this work. And then finally, it just has to be said, in the bigger picture, lots and lots is known about how to improve outcomes for infants. If that's our aim, we know in the world that the major differences in outcomes between different populations of infants have to do with dire inequalities in access to prenatal health services and the basics of life, safety, and housing, and so on. And those interventions include having a birth attendant who is well trained, having a community health center, having access to vaccines, having freedom from violence. So in the bigger picture, these small findings of subtle perturbations during the fetal period that lead to subtle changes in births that are well within the schema of normal health it needs to be situated in this larger picture of inequality and public health outcomes. So no, I wouldn't say we shouldn't do the research. It's fascinating. And these are long-standing questions, as I said. I mean, since Aristotle. I'm not supposed to say that as a Harvard historian. I'm supposed to be way more sophisticated than that. But, these are long-standing concerns, theories, and so on. And it's not about not doing the research or doing it, but it's about surrounding it with the proper criticality and having the proper standards for the field for asserting risk claims that should translate into human practice.
That's really helpful. It's a really interesting answer. I'm going to pick, this isn't a response to your whole answer, because I'm picking one tiny bit of what I heard from it, but I wanted to say it back and make sure I got it, because I had a sort of light bulb moment from it. So you pointed out that with the maternal effects research, you don't get a comparison of the importance of the maternal fetal effects versus other kinds of influences. And so it really is, it's not research into how important are, how significant are maternal effects for offspring. It is a question of what are the maternal effects, right? How do they work? So it is kind of this narrow, zoomed-in question that assumes an importance to the influence in the posing of the question.
Yes. In other words, you're reporting, if you have just the dyad of data about mothers and data about offspring, and you find associations between those things, that's all you found. In that data set, associations between those two things. And there are many examples which I relate in the book that when you just include fathers also and their health history in the data set, some very common claims have actually been overturned. One of them is about the effect of obesity in the mother on metabolic outcomes in the offspring. Well, when you include fathers in the story, the maternal effect it goes away. And there are many examples like that. And that's just simply including one other important variable.
Thank you. Okay, so I accidentally walked us back into the science a bit because I got caught up and was interested in that. But I do have one last question before we move to questions that you all want to pose. And that has to do with sort of asking you to expand out what you've said and what you found about the interface between the scientific research and the public reception and public influences on that research to other places where science interfaces with society. So in particular to scientific research that bears on issues of significant public concern. What are the lessons in general for science of that, in that category in general?
Wow. I'm going to return to the important point about risk discourse. And boy, have we been through it over the last 18 months with risk discourse, right? And our tolerance for risk to a fetus there have been cognitive studies that show that once you present the idea of maternal harm to an infant, to a reader, they literally cannot get outside of that frame. It is so disturbing to hear that idea. And so we need to think deeply about how we contextualize and weigh risks and how we attribute to individual beings the responsibility to control those risks. Go back to begin before birth, where the individual mother should do some yoga. I mean, think of the class assumptions, just so much going on there to address stress, which is pervasive. We all experience stress all the time. And instead of thinking about a mother, an individual who is surrounded by multiple stressors, most of which are not in their control. So I come out of this thinking we need more frameworks than just something is a risk or it's not a risk. And we need numeracy to try to understand statistics about those risks, yes. But we also need to have a healthier understanding of our changing and increasingly low tolerance for any sort of risk whatsoever, and the discursive power of that concept. There's a risk, right, for controlling our response to different scenarios. And so I think I would say that this maternal-fetal case gives us a particularly enriched example of that, right? Like a very emotionally enriched, very politically charged, right, area of risk discourse with extremely real implications for the conduct of the lives of anyone who is hailed as a woman of reproductive age. And those are broad consequences that are often shunted aside in the name of postulating a risk to a fetus. And yet, with very little evidence that these kinds of behaviors empirically improve child outcomes.
Thank you. That's a great ending point. Thank you so much. So please please join me in thanking Sarah. And then thank you. And then I think John is going to lead us here.
Yes.
Here, you can have mine.
I found it.
Okay.
far. If you have questions, I want everyone to hear them, so you raise your hand and I bring you the microphone. Terrific. I'll put this back on.
Have you studied the impact of taking fertility drugs on the fetus? For example, if fertility drugs cause twins to be born and one twin comes out normal and the other one is considered to be autistic, what is the effect of that?
So there is a body of work on twins, specifically on twins, and there is a body of work much more modest on various fertility drugs and practices around that. With twins, they've long been of interest because they are generally born smaller, and so this relates to the birth weight story. Twins are an exception to some of the claims that have been made about the poor outcomes of being born smaller because they tend to do fine. They tend not to have those same outcomes. I can say less about fertility drugs and their implications, although that is a hot area of interest. I'll just jump from that question to gestational surrogacy as an interesting arena where maternal-fetal scientists are seeing the possibility, previously foreclosed because of ethical reasons, of disambiguating the effects of the womb in which you are gestated from your genetic endowment in human populations. So it is true, however, that there have been millions of babies born using reproductive technologies since the 1970s. And if there were to have been major effects of those kinds of interventions, I think they would have popped out at us at this point. The story of autism is much more complex. I've written about that in another context. So attributing that to a fetal exposure is challenging for many, many reasons. And there are not a lot of good theories, or there's not a lot of good cross-contextual evidence identifying singular factors that could be associated with autism. But it's certainly plausible and within the theoretical range that autism is a developmental disorder that could be caused by many different possible factors, including something in the developmental process prenatally. Yeah. But the larger point you make is that with reproductive technologies, there's a whole different set of conditions in the world, historically speaking, for the development of fetuses, and creates a different set of contextual variables for thinking about those outcomes, which underscores the historicity of bodies and of mothering and of the maternal-fetal relation itself. Thank you.
Awesome. I was wondering, when you're talking about the history of science and how you're tracking how different forms and contexts in science impacts the science itself, like research questions and how studies are conducted, how the history of eugenics in the U.S. and across the globe in 1880s through 1940s sort of affected our ideas of motherhood and parental role and genetic effect.
Absolutely. So the question was about eugenics. And traditionally, we associate eugenics with a period of hard genetic determinism. So that the focus would be on the health of the sperm and the egg and that nuclear genetic material in the sperm and the egg, and very little else matters, right? So the idea was to mate better people with better people and to prevent the reproduction of those with bad germplasm. So that idea represents one construct within eugenics. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that actually eugenics was an extremely diverse movement with a lot of ideas about reproductive uplift. And one of the projects of the book is to reconstruct what eugenicists thought about prenatal influences. And that led me to a whole interesting body, a subfield of research on environmental uplift through reproduction and prenatal influences. So it divides largely into two groups. First of all, it's true that prenatal influences was not of huge interest to eugenicists. They were very much about the gene. And so it ends up being a period of concern, if anything, about prenatal influences, of concern about the health of the gamete, of the sperm and of the egg. So among that group of eugenicists who are concerned about the health of what they called the germ plasm, right, they're concerned about preconception health. And interestingly, the reproductive politics that follows from this is very, very different from that which is considered common sense today. So as I show, during this period, leading eugenicists focused their discourses on prenatal influences on men. Men were considered to have the far riskier gamete. They were considered to engage in riskier behavior and to carry greater reproductive risks to offspring through their damage to their sperm. So there's an incredible amount of literature during this period directing men to guard their sperm and directing women to select men who have guarded their sperm well. And so that's one part of what happened during the eugenic era, a very different biopolitics of reproductive risk, primarily focused on the father rather than on the mother. So it tells you where we physically locate exposure matters for who is held responsible. Now, there's another eugenic discourse which I touched on earlier when talking to Angela, which were the people insisting on the importance of gestational influences. They were hangovers from the Lamarckian period. They wanted to argue that you could overcome a bad germplasm by good conduct during the gestational period. And I was writing this chapter while I was pregnant with my first child, and I absolutely loved reading these materials, which would say things like, you should do mathematical equations while you are pregnant to endow a mathematical spirit in your fetus. You should, and they were feminist tracts that said, you should think, I am strong, I am, right, I am independent, and you could endow your offspring with this zeal. And it's an incredible body of literature that was quite widely shared at the time about overcoming. So it's sort of, it accepts that the gene and the germplasm is quite determinative and then offers hope for overcoming it through gestational, or what they use, the term they used was prenatal culture, culturing during the prenatal period. And the books had very specific step-by-step, month-by-month guides as to what kinds of behavior the mother should engage in to embryologically train their child. And I could go on and on about this. But yeah, so it remained, because people have been so focused on the history of eugenics as it relates to the control of reproduction through interdictions on marriage and through sterilization, we actually just don't know as much about what they said about prenatal influences. And so a fun part of the book was getting to reconstruct and tell that story.
I was really intrigued by the idea of risk discourse. And I was wondering whether you found that discourse shapes this and intersects with the funding processes of scientists who, like, do they get trapped within, and their funding comes more because they can buy into that discourse and use it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that helps answer Angela's question about the interface between public reception and uptake of scientific research and the research that is done. It's really a looping effect, right? So you have to generate concern and the idea of a risk and social excitement around an idea in order to get funding for it. I do think it's part of the looping effect of then doing research only on maternal-fetal effects, which creates a reservoir of data and deeply carved track lines for research in this field, which makes it incredibly challenging for a researcher to break out of that model, right? You have to reinvent the field. There are these large data sets all around the world that have been made up only of, or largely of, maternal and fetal mother and child dyad data. And so that's all you've got for decades, right? That's nice, but to actually ask the question, you would have to totally reinvent the field. So yes, I think claims of risk in the popular realm help establish an environment receptive to funding applications, and scientists can become hamstrung in this looping process. Those who I've talked with who are doing paternal effects research feel this acutely. They've really had a hard time articulating the importance of also including fathers in the research. And as I said, that's just one step away from towards what we really need to do, which is a very fulsome, much more fulsome picture of exposures throughout early development. So yes, I think the funding environment is key, and then this also relates to long-standing social priorities around maternal and infant health, a well-defined field, right? And the way in which epigenetics and fetal programming research promises a molecular platform for doing that research. And so it creates a sort of new excitement and a promise around research in this field, now connecting with the new post-genomic science. It sounds like I'm saying it's all bunk. I'm not. I'm saying that this sort of work reflects this wider set of contingencies and constraints and contexts for doing scientific research, which includes current trends in the biomedical sciences. And you're right, that links directly to funding priorities.
Mine is sort of building on that and maybe almost asking the same question, but I wonder how influential your, I guess I would call meta way of thinking is starting to influence, or is it influencing the publications in the biomedical field? Do you see that carryover there where the ones that are doing that kind of research are starting, or maybe farther than starting, to think in the ways that you're talking about?
I do think that there is there's a group of epistemologically sophisticated researchers who are interested in causality in this moment. And so I definitely have benefited from their work. And they're really asking, well, what can we make of all of these findings, these associations? And how can we triangulate ourselves to a better account of causality? How can we test these relations and understand whether there is a mediation with the prenatal period or not? So yes, I think there's a small group of very interesting conceptual thinkers who are engaging with the question of causality in biomedicine. I myself have dialogued with many researchers in the field, interviewed them, gone to their conferences, spoken at their conferences, been invited into their spaces to speak about this work, and sometimes collaborated and written with them to try to characterize some of these issues. So there is some receptivity in parts of the field. There was an editorial in Nature, I think, last year, and Angela will like this. It said, we need to put the philosopher back in the PhD, right? That is that there is a real need for conceptual training and for the space and time to step back and think about the conceptual and inferential framework of what one is doing, about the space of alternative possible explanations and theories, and about how one's work inevitably, whatever researchers in this field intend to do, their work goes out into a world that will attach those findings to maternal responsibilities and to claims about risks to fetuses. And awareness of that in the way they construct their research, the terminology they use, and the causal claims that they make from it is critically important. But scientists often do not have the space, time, or training, or incentive structure to engage with that work, and so there is a partitioning out of that kind of project. I'm very, very lucky that I'm allowed to think about these things all of the time. And the challenge then is to bring scientists into dialogue with it. And I think in modest ways, I am seeing that happening. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. We are so excited that you are here. Thank you. I'm so excited that I have 2 questions. So if you don't get to the second one, that's fine. But the first is, in my classes, I used to show this old cartoon from Bust magazine that said, it was a spoof on the alcohol warning labels that say, pregnant women, do not consume alcohol. And instead this spoof said, men, warning, drinking 3 or more alcoholic beverages will turn you into a raging, violent asshole. You know, like, don't do it. And so I wonder, can you elaborate on that and can you show us the counterfactual world? What does the world look like if we did take paternal impact seriously? What questions would we ask? What inferences would we draw? What behavioral recommendations would we make if the paternal researchers that you know got funded?
So of course I don't think, I love that, but of course I don't think that a better world would be to apply the same set of inferential practices, which are impoverished in the ways that I've described, to fathers, and then we've just got more of these sorts of claims. It would cushion and the wide berth given just to the claims about mothers, but I do think that it is certainly valid to look at paternal effects alongside maternal effects within the field as it is currently defined. I think again, I would go back to the larger question, which is this information that is useful to and sought after by the individuals who would use it? Some of the researchers, just to go back to the last question and connect to the last question, some of the researchers in this field are now starting by asking parents, what kinds of claims do you want us to investigate? What information do you need, right? In ways that build up from the needs and experiences of parents in our world. So my colleague, Renee Almelling, has just written a book called Gynecology, and it is about exactly these questions, the neglect of thinking about men's bodies as reproductive in any way, right? It's almost as if we still live in a paradigm where the idea is that the man just gives the spark and the woman does the forming and really creates the organism. And so this has led to an extreme asymmetry for men in thinking about their own reproductive health. And there certainly may be insights that would be useful to men. So what's your second question?
The second question relates to your gender scilab research. I was really intrigued by I think it came out in July, your study about COVID, health differentials by gender, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and or what other gendered implications from COVID that you all are studying at the gender scilab.
Yeah, so when COVID started, first of all, we were very depressed for a bit, and then we said, well, what can we use our tools to do usefully? So there has been a disparity between men and women in COVID outcomes noted in many populations. We wanted to better understand that disparity. Immediately, the recourse was to biological sex differences as the cause. But as gender analysts of health and medicine and science, we rarely see examples of epidemiological problems like that are not a mix of various factors. And we felt there was an under-investigation of important ways in which different occupational exposures, different health behaviors, and different and heterogeneity in this sex disparity across different locations and across different social and ethnic and racial groups were being noted. So we have on the GenderSci website, which is kind of fun to play with, a tracker. We are the only tracker available to look at sex disparities in US states. I think globally we have the most fine-grained data set of sex disparities. Every Monday morning we collect them from all 50 states, and we've been tracking them since the beginning of the pandemic. What this data shows is that the claims about large sex differences in outcomes from COVID are actually not appreciating the heterogeneity across space in these outcomes. So some states, like Connecticut, have virtually equal outcomes for men and women from COVID, and some states, like Texas, do not. And this huge variation suggests us a role for social and contextual factors. And so we have been the leading voice in making the point that it is critical to target those who are vulnerable due to social structural exposures. We've also looked at this across racial and ethnic groups, and this might be the paper that you're referring to. So in the claims about men being more at risk than women, what you do is you obscure the heterogeneity among men and among women. And when women were seen as low risk, what was lost sight of was the extremely high risk for certain populations of women. And we showed that black women had far worse outcomes than, say, white men. Right? So if you are only looking at the gender binary, those sorts of phenomena will be ignored. So we do feel we've been able to be a positive voice in the space, an ameliorative voice to help people think about how social factors can play a role in determining what appears to be a sex difference. And so we're continuing to do that work and publish in that area. And happy to talk about the GenderSci work that we do, which again is interdisciplinary work with scientists and humanists. Thank you.
Is there anything else you want us to know?
No, I think that's great.
We could keep going, or we could.
You're the boss.
One question here.
I think we have one more, yes.
Okay.
We have two more.
Could you speak a little bit about mitochondria? It seems like it, between the strict genetic stuff and the maternal effects, it seems like it's a mixture there.
Yeah, so mitochondrial inheritance is a form of maternal inheritance in the sense that it is, you receive your mitochondria from your mother through the cytoplasm. We tend to distinguish between maternal inheritance and maternal effects, which is more of the effect of the phenotype or genotype of the mother independent of transmission. So we categorize typically mitochondrial inheritance or plasmid or chlorophyll inheritance in plants is considered a form of transmission genetics, like I introduced at the beginning. In contrast, we have this more ephemeral, fuzzy field that brings together so many diverse possible environmental exposures internal to the mother's body, in the external environment as transmitted or vectored through the mother's body, that fall under this this construct of maternal effects. So thank you for asking that clarifying question.
I can't help commenting on the COVID issue. Nobody is measuring exposure to virus. So all of these claims about relative risk are pretty meaningless. Anyways, my question to you is, can you share with us your opinions about the growing dominance of corporate biotech in public policy, in public health? The pandemic being one example.
Thinking very broadly about bioscience and what I've called post-genomics, which is a different regime for organizing life science research. A concern for ideals of open science, transparent science, democratic science, accountable and ethical science is that a very large proportion of bioscience research is happening in this proprietary realm. We have ideals about how science works, that peer review, the free exchange of ideas, shared standards for evidence and the evaluation of that evidence. Those are all imperiled by not only the increasing way in which bioscience research happens in this proprietary environment, which often puts up a wall to those kinds of processes, but other changes too, like the increasing globalization of bioscience research, which creates a very large volume of research answering to often different standards for documentation. So, and using extremely sophisticated methods of data mining that make it impossible for any one individual to actually evaluate the science. So I'm combining your question with other developments and aspects of our post-genomic life sciences world. But if, as some believe, 60% or more of life science research is actually happening in this proprietary realm, that in itself raises concerns about the practice of science and the trustworthiness of its findings. Now, some research in a corporate context behaves according to the same rules as research in a non-corporate context. We can't necessarily make generalizations. The infusion of funding into private science sometimes leads to incredibly rapid breakthroughs that serve humanity and serve health. And some research happening in, say, a nonprofit context is just as inflected by interests in all sorts of ways as some corporate research could be characterized as. So it's heterogeneous, but what matters here is that it's an enormous field of action that does not conform to old-style Mertonian ideas of how science works in any way, shape, or form. We need new ideals, new constructs for evaluating scientific research and testing it. Very little biomedical research is replicated. Very little biomedical research is ever even cited. We have extreme problems in the trustworthiness of the research given these conditions. There are more than 10,000 papers coming out every year. It's impossible for any individual to really be a broad expert within this arena. And so we have to acknowledge that, have some humility, even as it seems like the science is going at breakneck speed. We could go on and on about this, but you're really asking a question about the sociology and social conditions of knowledge production. And those social conditions, science is not just a pile of accumulated facts. It is findings that have been vetted and evaluated and accepted by a community. But what then is that community? Sometimes it's well defined. We know who are the experts and who should be evaluating it. Like in the case of, say, the vaccines, which have gone through a vetting process through the FDA and a very public and transparent process there. But that kind of process doesn't apply to a lot of other emerging areas of science. That's confusing for consumers of the science, for people who rely on it for their health. It's challenging however, even for people within the field, right? So very, very difficult issues to address that require all of our expertise, right? Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Angela. Sarah's book is for sale. We do sell books here. she gets all the money, or someone gets all the money. We don't. I don't know where the money goes, but I know where it doesn't go. If you have questions that you didn't get, you could probably grab her now. And once again, thank you for coming to the Mercantile Library. We'll see you soon.